This is the ARC, the Alcohol Recovery Centre. The ARC is a mobile drunk tank, a 65-foot converted truck trailer designed to alleviate the pressure on the NHS, the National Hangover Service, at times of celebration in England. It's a clever name, but naturally, in England, where it was introduced in 2014, it was promptly nicknamed the Booze Bus. Perhaps we should be grateful the British public didn't vote on the name, because we probably would have called it something like Pisshead McBusface. Today, if you black out drunk on the pavement on Bristol High Street, you're more likely to wake up inside Pisshead McBusface than you are in Bristol General Hospital. Inside the ARC, there are showers, beds, staff and medical facilities to treat those who've become so drunk the police have had to intervene. And there you'll be checked over and either discharged or sent on for more urgent treatment, or allowed to sleep off your celebrations in relative safety. Reception to the ARC has been mixed in the UK. During its Bristol trial, through a busy Christmas period, it housed an average of 17 people a night. Extrapolated out, the Booze Bus could potentially treat around 6,000 people per year who would otherwise be taking up Bristol's hospital beds. Advocates of the system say the ARC frees up emergency services for more urgent cases and protects vulnerable, intoxicated people. Critics, however, say it sends a message that excessive drinking is acceptable, and that by offering extremely intoxicated people a safe place, the negative consequences for public drunkenness are undermined. Whichever side of that argument you find yourself on, it's true to say that the treatment of public drunks hasn't always been so forgiving. Until very recently, drunk tanks have been horrific, filthy, and often unsupervised holding pens into which drunks were thrown until they sobered up. And while you were there, you may have been subject to humiliation, violence, and experimentation without your consent. Brothers, sisters, comrades and friends, welcome to Alky-traz. The origins of the drunk tank. The dawn of the first industrial revolution, beginning around 1760, drove men from their fields and their agricultural labour in the verdant British countryside into the dark and grimy cities in search of a salary. In 1750, 80% of Britain's 6 million people lived in villages and farmsteads, and only 20% lived in the cities. 150 years later, by 1900, the population had exploded sixfold to 37 million, with 75% of them now in the cities and only 25% in the countryside. This upheaval caused a fundamental shift in the psychology of British society, one that would soon be exported around the world. 19th century factory labourers faced working hours from dawn till dusk in dangerous, noisy and filthy conditions for low pay and under unrelenting stress. Coupled to that, a sense of redundancy and disenfranchisement spread among the men of the working class, as the jobs their fathers did were replaced by machinery, and those who could work with their hands began to be valued less than those who could work with numbers. The Industrial Revolution caused a crisis of masculinity, reshaping gender roles and social identities. Within a single generation, men went from a master of their trade to a cog in an engine, performing repetitive, monotonous tasks, and machines devalued physical human strength. Labourers who had left the countryside seeking steady pay became poorer than ever, living with large families in urban squalor, while accountants and managers, the new middle class, became the dominant force in British society. And the same industrial production that forced British men out of the countryside and into the factories also offered a salve: alcohol. Like everything else, alcohol production was industrialized. It became cheap and abundant, and the workforce, the working class, lived on a diet of pickled fish, beer, and gin. These staples sometimes standing in for actual wages when a business struggled. Between 1720 and 1751, gin consumption rose sixfold. And by the turn of the 19th century, London had a gin shop for every 15 people. Pubs and taverns multiplied around factories, and men would spill out of work and straight into the bottom of a glass, and then spill out of the pubs at closing time to hobble home, only to repeat the cycle again the following day and double their drinking efforts on days off. The landscape of Victorian cities was bleak, and alcohol was a readily available escape from the danger, fatigue, and monotony of Britain during the Industrial Revolution. The alcohol only adding fuel to a sense of loneliness and alienation that British men haven't overcome even to this day. Drinking wasn't part of British culture, it was the culture, and it substituted for the feeling of community that industrial Britain had left behind. And sadly, not everyone who spilled out of the tavern after work would make it home. In some cases, in port cities like Liverpool, Bristol, and Portsmouth, you might black out in the street outside a tavern and wake up aboard a ship with the king's shilling in your pocket, having been press-ganged into naval service. This was not technically illegal, and although naval officers had an official mandate to impress only experienced mariners into service, press gangs often ignored that and grabbed whoever they could to fill their quota, usually drunks. In fact, there are rumours that tavern keepers would be paid by the press gangs to get able-bodied men as drunk as possible so that they would be easier to subdue. These are unusual exceptions, though. Usually, those spilling out of taverns too drunk to stand or too incoherent to give the police an address could expect a light beating with a truncheon in an alleyway, or worse, a night in a specially designated drunk cell. By the 19th century, police stations started to incorporate large, drunken disorderly cells into their designs, usually at the far corner of the station, to minimize the disruption from any noise therein. These cells could accommodate a number of inmates with bare wooden plank beds, concrete floors and walls, and no windows. They were often freezing cold and with no running water. They were chaotic places that existed outside the law. One story from an 1880 edition of the Illustrated Police News describes a man waking up in a cell beside his sleeping horse, which had been impounded with him and ushered into the cell after he was arrested for singing duets with the animal in Cheapside. The American Frontier. Drunk Justice. At exactly the same time alcoholism was wreaking havoc on the working class in Britain, it was being exported to the New World too, most notably Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and America. In the American West, the same sense of alienation and disenfranchisement was caused not by industry, but by geography. Small townships were appearing, separated from each other by days' worth of travel, and the people moving between them were often dispossessed immigrants from the old world who had left the smoke and noise of the Industrial Revolution behind them, but brought the disenfranchisement and loneliness with them, and the alcohol too. These small townships could rarely offer a whole cell devoted to drunks in their meagre police stations, so local sheriffs would use whatever was at hand. Barns, improvised shacks, and empty water tanks would be used to house those too drunk to make it home from the saloon, and it's from these water tanks that we get the name drunk tank. Anything could be a drunk tank. A local story from 1870s Deadwood, South Dakota, holds that Sheriff Seth Bullock had to lock a drunken cowboy inside a large barrel for the night. In the morning, he tipped the barrel over, opened it, and told the cowboy if he could stand, he could go. The cowboy still couldn't stand, so the sheriff locked him back in for another day. And this attitude to public drunkenness would be the norm for decades in America. Around the turn of the 20th century, drunk tanks were no longer attached to a jailhouse. For convenience and to save the local police long trips to the cells and back just to deal with a drunk, isolated shacks would be built in hotspots of public intoxication. Quoting now from Randy Samuelson Brown's book, The Bad Old Days of Colorado. In Denver, drunkenness was one of the most prevalent nuisance crimes. There were 3 levels of inebriation as far as the law was concerned: simple drunk, big drunk, and drunk and disorderly. There were also notorious drunk tanks or kiosks located on city corners, poorly ventilated structures about the size of closets. Inebriants were thrown into these handy structures, saving transport time. These holding structures would have been brutally cold in the winter and fearfully hot in the summer. Other than photographs, there is scant record about these kiosks, but it seems likely people were occasionally tossed in and forgotten. If so, it stands to reason that some poor drunks might have perished in these tiny contraptions. These structures eventually became more permanent and were ultimately made from bricks or stone. An anecdote from Paul Kirkman's Missouri Outlaws recounts the story of a mason who built the drunk tank in Mocaine, Missouri, only to become its first occupant when he got horrendously drunk to celebrate its completion. Until the end of the 20th century, when the dangerous nature of sudden alcohol withdrawal was better understood, there was little regard given to drunk tanks or their occupants. They remained a legal grey area for most of that century, a place in which, often, those inside had been detained but not arrested, or had committed no identifiable crime and yet were not permitted to leave. This vague legal framework made them kind of international waters for certain purposes, and the police learned to use them to their advantage. Quite aside from the ordinary violence and denial of medical care in the drunk tank, away from the eyes of the world, those detained in drunk tanks were not always even drunk. In 1912, San Diego passed an unpopular law banning public speaking, specifically targeting socialist activists from the left-wing unionist organization International Workers of the World. The law led to widespread unrest and violence known today as the San Diego free speech fight, and in the process, many of the movement's leading activists were arrested and deposited in the drunk tank rather than the jail. According to activist Charles Pierce, while in the drunk tank, they were repeatedly subject to violence by police officers and were threatened with the injection of formaldehyde into the tank, and later, some strangling sort of gas was injected. That's as quoted in Free Speech for Radicals by Theodore Schroeder. And around the same time, in Santa Rita, the drunk tank was also used as a way to imprison women fighting for equal rights, according to the book The Free Speech Movement by David Lance Goines. The use of the drunk tank as a method of suppression continued through the civil rights era in the 50s and 60s. For example, after 12 members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee were arrested in Magnolia, Mississippi, James P. Marshall writes in Student Activism and Civil Rights in Mississippi that they were held and forced to spend 2 months in a tiny drunk tank, which they described in a smuggled out letter as being nothing more than a concrete bunker. Things began to change, at least in the US, in 1971, when public drunkenness was decriminalized. By 1980, independent studies began to emerge into the drunk tank phenomena and the abuses therein, and some of the conclusions are savage. It's in this period that we get the first comprehensive descriptions of conditions within the drunk tanks. In Goldfarb's 1975 book, Jails: The Ultimate Ghetto, a Washington reporter is quoted describing what a drunk tank is actually like. There are at least 2 men in each 4 by 8 foot cell and 3 in some. The stench of cheap alcohol, dried blood, urine, and excrement covers the cell block. There are no lights in the cells, which form a square in the middle of the cell block. There are no mattresses. Mattresses wouldn't last a night, a patrolman explains. And with prisoners urinating all over them, they wouldn't be any good if they did last. It's quiet tonight, the policeman says. But some nights it gets so bad we have to close these. He points to 2 wooden green doors in front of the gate. It was on one of the noisy nights earlier this month that a prisoner is alleged to have beaten his cellmate to death. That same year, 1975, an independent commission in California describes how the floor of a local drunk tank had become so disgusting that a wooden deck had been added to elevate the inmates from the layer of filth and grime below. Wooden slats are often placed on the floor so the prisoners, lying like snakes in a snake pit, will be kept partially out of their own filth, so the deck can be hosed down from time to time. Change happened quickly. By 1980, independent reports began to study not just the nature of drunk tanks, but their emotional impact too, and unfortunately, they uncovered the disproportionate rates of suicide in drunk tanks. Quoting now from a 1980 paper with the fabulous title, A Report from the First National Conference on the Public Inebriate. Jails are designed to hold people awaiting trial and those serving short-term sentences. They are not built to meet the medical and mental health needs of homeless, chronic alcoholics. Public inebriates run a high risk of suicide in jail. Dr. Paige Hudson, Chief Medical Examiner of North Carolina, reported that in a study he did of deaths in North Carolina jails from 1972 to 1976, 1/3 of the deaths were suicides. More than half of these suicides took place during the first 12 hours in jail, and 85% of the people who committed suicide were intoxicated. 1/2 of those who died during the first 24 hours after arrest were intoxicated at the time of death. It is estimated that intoxicated people make up over half of those in jail in North Carolina. When an alcoholic is going through withdrawal symptoms, he is frightened and in extreme pain, at risk for such endangering events as seizures, liver failure, and delirium tremens. Most jails are not able to provide the supportive environment, medical attention, and helping atmosphere so critical to the care of alcoholics during withdrawal. Police do not routinely take intoxicated people to hospitals as they do others with obvious physical problems. Alcoholics are not considered really sick. The truth is, everyone knew all of this already. Everyone knew drunk tanks were terrible, inhumane places, but no one cared. They were considered a necessary evil. To this day, there is a socio-cultural sense that drunk people deserve their misfortune, and since they drank the alcohol that got them drunk, they are less deserving of treatment. Politically though, things have moved on, and while it's not difficult to find old-school drunk tanks in rural places across Europe and North America, there has been a cognitive shift in which public intoxication is now considered a health issue rather than a criminal issue. Today, drunk tanks have rebranded. They are sobering centres, or better yet, alcohol recovery centres. Thank you, Pisshead McBusface. Okay, that's it for today. I would like to thank the Patreon subscribers, my sponsors, for giving me the freedom to experiment with Bad Country and make episodes like this one possible. If you would like to support this channel more actively and see slightly more unconventional sobriety content, a little bit like this episode, then please head over to the Patreon. The link is in the description. Thank you very much for watching, and as always, good luck out there.